God, I ask you now, this is your message, not mine. These are your words, not mine, and may they be what you want them to be in this time and in this space. Each year, as we celebrate Advent, we are observing a time of waiting and preparation. We are waiting. We have been waiting for a very long time. Ancient Israel waited for the promises of God to be fulfilled. They waited for a time when they would no longer face persecution and Yahweh's justice and peace would reign throughout the earth. Similarly, the early Christians waited for the imminent return of the Messiah. I know that each of us here has our own idea of what awaits us when the visions described in today's scripture passages are fulfilled. But I want to ask you to take a moment and think. Reflect back on what Barb read just a moment ago. Close your eyes and think. What kind of world do you imagine? I imagine a world where young girls are given equal access to education and healthcare. I imagine a world where young boys and young men aren't trapped in a cycle of poverty and violence. I imagine a world where no one goes hungry at night. What do you imagine? God promises us that Jesus will return, swords will be turned into plowshares, and we will have justice and peace. But we have been waiting a very long time. How much longer must we wait? Women make up half of the global population, yet 70% of the world's poor. They lack access to health care, education, and employment. Women and girls around the globe face gender-based violence and discrimination. We have been waiting. Here in Chicago and all across the country, we suffer from an epidemic of gun violence. Around the world, the international arms trade continues to be profitable, despite the efforts of the United Nations to prevent guns from being sold into areas engaged in violent conflict. We have been waiting. We live in the wealthiest, most developed nation in the world, yet 46 million Americans lived in poverty last year, including 22% of children. Systematic problems make it difficult for all people to break free of that cycle of poverty here and around the world. We have been waiting. Today's passage from Matthew presents a pressing view of what we have been waiting for, when all will be as God has promised. We are told not even Jesus knows the time, but he will come like a thief in the night, so we must remain vigilant for the return of Christ. Early Christians hearing this message could have never imagined that 2,000 years later, we would still be waiting. They believed Christ's return would happen in their own lifetime. They expected him to return, and soon. And after such a long time of waiting, God had finally sent the Messiah that had been promised to them in Isaiah, and then they were expected to wait some more. The desire for a peace like that described in Isaiah is what drew me to study international relations when I was in college. As someone who is no longer studying international relations, I sometimes describe my reasoning for this choice when I was 18 and had to declare a major was that I had this naive hope that true peace could be achieved. The problem is once I actually got there and all the politics, the field just seemed so discouraging. During my studies, I became acquainted with the Rwandan genocide. Tensions between the Hutus and Tutsis, groups based more on arbitrary colonial divisions than actual ethnicity, had existed for years. But in 1994, in a violent genocide that lasted 100 days, over 8,000 people were killed, fueled by the media and political propaganda. In the 21st century, we have become accustomed to the most advanced military technology. But in an interesting turn of events, the majority of this genocide was carried out using simple farming machetes. Somehow, in our lifetime, we've seen even that beautiful, hopeful image that Isaiah presents corrupted as the plowshares themselves were turned into swords. We have been waiting. During the Middle Ages, an anonymous monk compiled the promises of God that had been fulfilled through Jesus into a chant that became known as the O Antiphons, and a time that we know as the Dark Ages, when very few people could read or write, or even had access to the Bible. He recorded the prophecies that had been fulfilled in Jesus in a hopeful chant which reminded Christians of the promises of God and called for Christ's return. And after being handed down century through century, almost 1,000 years later, this text was translated and set to music. We know this song as O Come, Emmanuel. This song and its history remind us, after the centuries of Christians who wondered, just as we do, how much longer must we wait? But what are we waiting for? Emmanuel means God with us, and during his time on earth, Jesus was just that. Both Isaiah and Matthew express a deep hope that once again, someday, God will be with us and we will be with God. It is in this longing hope that we celebrate during Advent, a hope for Emmanuel and the peace, joy, and love that accompany that promise. But just as Jesus is imploring his disciples in Matthew, this hope isn't just about waiting for the kingdom to come, but living in the kingdom now. As people created in the image of God, God lives in us too. Jesus is not in some far-off, distant time that we are waiting for. Jesus is with us now. In the very next chapter of Matthew, Jesus tells us that whatever we do for the least of these, we do for him. In light of this, our passage from today from Matthew is a call to embody Christ in the world. We don't know the day or the hour, but while we're waiting, we can make sure that God's love continues to be poured out into the world. We have been waiting while God has been waiting for us. What are we waiting for? While the world hopes for peace and justice, how can we become Christ's hope in the world? O come, Emmanuel, it becomes not just a call for Christ to return, but a call for us to be Christ. We are to rejoice because Emmanuel is not coming, Emmanuel has come. This call is summed up by another Christmas song I remember from my childhood. The chorus goes, O Emmanuel, God with us, Spirit revealed in us, that we may be your hope to the world. O Emmanuel, God with us, a light to break the darkness, that we may show your hope to the world, Emmanuel, be God in us. We have hope in the most unlikely circumstances that God will keep his promises. This tradition of hope is deeply rooted in the traditions of ancient Israel. And both of our texts today reflect this type of hope. We're presented in Isaiah with a prophecy of peace. In Matthew, we are reminded that someday all will be put right. For Christians, hope is much more than just optimism or wishful thinking. Cornel West highlights this distinction well. He says, hope and optimism are different. Optimism tends to be based on the notion that there's enough evidence out there to believe that things are going to be better. It's much more rational, deeply secular, whereas hope looks at all the evidence and says, it doesn't look good at all. It doesn't look good at all. We're going to go beyond the evidence to create new possibilities based on visions that become contagious against all odds, that people might engage in heroic actions against the odds, no guarantees whatsoever. I think it's that kind of hope that captured my interest about the Rwandan genocide. The hope seen in the reconciliation process that followed once the killing had stopped. Because after 100 days, the short but violent conflict was over. Neighbors who had become killers became neighbors again. The Gacaca courts, a traditional form of justice, were adapted for the purposes of reconciling a nation. The system wasn't perfect. Rwanda is still healing. But Rwandans are hopeful for a time when this pain will be a distant memory. And gradually through this process, plowshares which had become swords became plowshares again. We live in a world where peace and justice like that described in Isaiah seems unobtainable. But we are called not just to hope that future day when Isaiah's prophecy is realized. We are called to be that hope for others and for ourselves in the world now. God has been waiting. What are we waiting